Elena Vasquez stared up at the massive iron gates of Harrington Estate, her small suitcase clutched tightly in her hand. The autumn wind whipped her dark hair across her face as she pressed the intercom button with a slightly trembling finger. This was it, her last chance to keep her family afloat. "State your business," a cold voice crackled through the speaker. "Elena Vasquez, sir. I'm the new maid. I have an appointment with Mr. Harrington at 9. A long pause followed. Then the gate swung open with an ominous creak. Elena took a deep breath and started up the long, winding driveway. Tall oak trees lined both sides, their branches creating dancing shadows on the path. In the distance, the mansion rose like something from another world, all stone and glass and sharp angles against the clear blue sky. She had never seen anything like it, except maybe in magazines or movies. 3 stories of architectural perfection, with floor-to-ceiling windows that gleamed in the morning sun. A sleek sports car and 2 luxury sedans sat in the circular driveway, each worth more than her family would see in years. Elena adjusted her simple black coat and straightened her shoulders. The job paid triple what she'd make anywhere else, enough to cover her mother's medical bills and keep a roof over their heads. She couldn't afford to be intimidated. Before she could knock, the massive front door swung open. A tall woman with steel gray hair pulled into a tight bun looked Elena up and down with piercing eyes. "You're 3 minutes late, Ms. Vasquez," she said, checking a slim watch on her wrist. "Mr. Harrington values punctuality above all else." "I'm sorry," Elena said quickly. "The bus was delayed and—" "Mr. Harrington doesn't care for excuses," the woman cut her off. "I'm Mrs. Hudson, the house manager. Follow me." Elena hurried after Mrs. Hudson through the vast entrance hall, her worn shoes silent against the polished marble floor. Crystal chandeliers hung from high ceilings and priceless artwork lined walls that seemed to stretch forever. Everything was immaculate without a speck of dust in sight. "You'll be expected to learn the layout quickly," Mrs. Hudson said without turning around. "Mr. Harrington detests having to repeat himself or give directions more than once. Your living quarters are on the east wing, 3rd floor. You'll have Sundays off unless Mr. Harrington is entertaining. His schedule takes priority over everything else." Elena nodded, trying to take it all in while keeping pace. They passed room after room, a library with books from floor to ceiling, a dining room that could seat 20, various sitting rooms with furniture that looked too perfect to actually use. "The staff entrance is at the back of the house. You are not to use the main entrance after today," Mrs. Hudson continued. "Uniform will be provided. Personal items are to be kept in your quarters only. Mr. Harrington doesn't like clutter or personal effects." Visible in the main house, they reached a long hallway lined with tall windows overlooking manicured gardens. At the end stood a door made of dark polished wood. "Mr. Harrington will see you now," Mrs. Hudson said, giving a sharp knock before opening the door. "Do not waste his time." Heart-pounding, Elena stepped into what appeared to be a home office bigger than her entire apartment. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking view of rolling hills and a lake in the distance. A massive desk dominated the center of the room, where a man sat with his back to her looking out at the view. "The new maid." "Sir," Mrs. Hudson announced before stepping out and closing the door. For several long moments, Richard Harrington didn't turn around or acknowledge Elena's presence. She stood awkwardly, unsure if she should speak first. Finally, the chair swiveled around. Richard Harrington was younger than she'd expected, maybe in his late 30s. Dark hair, precisely cut, framed a face with sharp cheekbones and cold blue eyes that assessed her with clinical detachment. His tailored suit probably cost more than a year of her rent. "Elena Vasquez," he said, glancing at a tablet on his desk. His voice was deep, smooth, with the kind of confidence that came from never having to question your place in the world. 26 years old, no formal education beyond high school, no previous experience working in a home of this caliber. He looked up at her with a raised eyebrow. "Not exactly an impressive resume." Elena swallowed hard. "I'm a quick learner, sir, and I'm not afraid of hard work." Something like amusement flickered across his face. "Everyone says that. Yet I've had 3 maids quit in the past 2 months. One lasted exactly 4 days before leaving in tears." Elena felt a chill run down her spine but kept her expression neutral. "I won't quit, Mr. Harrington." Bold statement. He leaned back in his chair, still studying her. "Why do you want this job, Ms. Vasquez? And don't give me platitudes about needing work. Everyone needs work." Elena hesitated, then decided honesty might be her best approach. "My mother is sick, sir. She needs specialized treatment that our insurance won't cover. This position pays enough to help her and keep us afloat." He seemed to consider this for a moment. "At least you're honest. Desperation is a better motivator than most." He stood up suddenly, walking around the desk. "Let me be clear about my expectations. I demand perfection in every aspect of my home. Everything has its place. I entertain important clients regularly, and the impression my home makes reflects directly on my business. If you break something, you're fired. If you disturb my work, you're fired. If you fail to complete your assigned tasks to Mrs. Hudson's satisfaction, you're fired." He walked to a window, hands clasped behind his back. "Your personal problems remain at the gate when you enter my property. I don't pay for sob stories or emotional baggage. I pay for results." Elena felt her cheeks burn but kept her voice steady. "I understand, sir." He turned to face her again. "Do you?" The last three didn't. One complained that the schedule was inhumane. Another that I was unreasonable for expecting windows cleaned twice weekly. The most recent one had the audacity to suggest I was too demanding when I pointed out dust she'd missed on my bookshelves. He walked closer to Elena, his gaze intensely focused. "So tell me, Ms. Vasquez, what makes you different?" Elena met his gaze directly. "I have more at stake than they did, Mr. Harrington. I can't afford to fail." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite approval, but perhaps a hint of respect. "We'll see." He returned to his desk and sat down. "Mrs. Hudson will explain your duties. You'll have a 1-week trial period. If you're still here after that, we'll discuss a more permanent arrangement. Thank you for the opportunity, sir." He waved his hand dismissively, already turning his attention back to his computer screen. "Don't thank me yet. You haven't earned it." Outside the office, Elena released the breath she'd been holding. Mrs. Hudson was waiting, her expression unreadable. "This way," she said, leading Elena down another hallway. "I'll show you where you'll be staying. Then we'll begin your training." The east wing was slightly less intimidating than the rest of the house, though no less luxurious. Mrs. Hudson opened a door on the 3rd floor, revealing a small but beautifully furnished bedroom with an attached bathroom. "Your quarters," she said. "You may arrange your personal items as you wish in here, but it must be kept tidy. Meals are at 6 a.m., noon, and 6 p.m. in the staff kitchen unless you're required elsewhere. Your uniform is in the wardrobe." Elena placed her suitcase on the bed, looking around in wonder. The room was nicer than anywhere she'd ever lived, with a plush queen bed, soft carpet, and even a small desk by the window. "This is very nice," she said quietly. Mrs. Hudson's stern expression softened slightly. "Mr. Harrington can be demanding, but he provides well for his staff. Those who meet his standards are rewarded accordingly." She checked her watch again. "You have 20 minutes to change and meet me in the kitchen. We'll start with the daily cleaning schedule." After Mrs. Hudson left, Elena sat on the edge of the bed, running her hands over the smooth comforter. She thought of her mother, now staying with her aunt in their cramped apartment, waiting for test results that would determine her treatment plan. She thought of the scholarship she'd had to give up at the music conservatory when her mother first fell ill, the piano she'd had to sell to cover initial medical expenses. She opened her suitcase and carefully took out a framed photograph, her mother and herself at her high school graduation, both smiling widely with hope for the future. Next to it, she placed the only other personal item she'd brought, a small wooden box containing her mother's wedding ring and a folded sheet of music, the last piece she'd been working on before. Everything fell apart. Elena changed quickly into the uniform, a simple black dress with a white collar, and pulled her hair back neatly. As she looked at herself in the mirror, she made a silent promise. She would survive here no matter how difficult Richard Harrington might be. She had endured worse for less. On her way to find the kitchen, Elena passed an open door that caught her eye. Curiosity getting the better of her, she paused to peek inside. The room was spacious with tall windows and warm lighting, and there in the center stood a magnificent grand piano, its polished surface gleaming in the sunlight. Her fingers tingled with the memory of keys beneath them, the joy of music flowing through her body. For a moment she was transported back to a different life, a different future. "That room is off limits unless you're cleaning it," Mrs. Hudson's voice came from behind her, making Elena jump. "Mr. Harrington doesn't play, but he keeps it maintained for guests. Come along now, we're behind schedule." Elena nodded quickly and followed, but not before casting one last glance at the beautiful instrument. She hurried after Mrs. Hudson, mentally preparing herself for whatever challenges lay ahead in this new life at Harrington Estate. What she didn't see was Richard Harrington watching from the shadows of the hallway. His eyes narrowed thoughtfully at her lingering gaze on the piano. He turned away, making a mental note of the strange look he'd seen on his new maid's face, a look of longing so deep it had transformed her entirely for just a brief moment. 3 months had passed since Elena first walked through the gates of Harrington Estate, and against all odds she had survived. The work was grueling, up at 5 a.m., finishing well past 8 p.m. most nights, but she had adapted to the demanding schedule and Richard Harrington's exacting standards. Mrs. Hudson had seemed almost surprised when Elena made it through the first week, then the second, then the first month. "You're either incredibly stubborn or incredibly desperate," she had remarked one evening as they reviewed the next day's tasks. "Both," Elena had replied with a tired smile. Today, however, was unlike any other day since she'd started. The mansion was buzzing with activity as staff prepared for Richard's biggest dinner party of the year. Apparently, he hosted this gathering annually for potential investors and business partners, people who could make or break multi-million-dollar deals with a single conversation. Elena had been assigned to prepare the guest rooms, polish the silver, and help arrange flowers that had been delivered by the truckload that morning. Her arms ached from reaching up to dust crystal chandeliers and scrubbing already spotless bathrooms to an even more immaculate state. Everything must be perfect, Mrs. Hudson kept repeating as she inspected Elena's work. Mr. Harrington's guests include 3 tech billionaires, a former senator, and the CEO of Meridian Industries. These people don't just expect perfection, they demand it. By late afternoon, Elena was putting the final touches on the dining room table when she heard raised voices coming from the direction of Richard's office. Curious, she moved closer to the doorway, pretending to adjust a flower arrangement. "What do you mean he's not coming?" Richard's voice was cold with controlled anger. "The party is in 3 hours. "I'm sorry, sir," came the apologetic voice of Richard's personal assistant, Thomas. "Mr. Kellerman just called. He's come down with food poisoning and can't possibly make it. He sends his deepest regrets. I don't care about his regrets. I care about having a pianist for this evening." The music was specifically planned to create the right atmosphere for discussions with the Meridian Group. Elena's ears perked up at the mention of a pianist. She hadn't known live music was part of the evening's plans. "I've already called 3 agencies," Thomas was saying, his voice strained. "Everyone is booked for Saturday night events. At this late notice, I don't want excuses, Thomas. I want solutions." There was a heavy silence, then the sound of papers shuffling. "Perhaps we could simply use the sound system, sir? I can create a playlist of classical, recorded music, like some common cocktail party." Richard's voice dripped with disdain. The whole point was to demonstrate culture and refinement. Meridian's CEO is a classical music enthusiast. Pressing play on a Spotify playlist hardly creates the impression I'm aiming for. Elena quickly moved away as she heard footsteps approaching the door. She busied herself with the place settings as Richard stormed past, not even glancing in her direction. Thomas followed, looking harried as he tapped frantically on his tablet. For the next 2 hours, the tension in the house was palpable as staff completed final preparations. Chefs worked frantically in the kitchen, security personnel checked the grounds, and Mrs. Hudson inspected every inch of the public spaces with military precision. Elena had just finished arranging fresh towels in the guest bathrooms when Mrs. Hudson's voice came through on the staff communication system. "All household staff to the main hall for final instructions before guests arrive." Downstairs, the entire staff stood in a line as Richard paced before them, dressed in an impeccably tailored tuxedo. His face was a mask of controlled frustration. "As you may have heard, our pianist is canceled," he said curtly. "The evening will proceed as planned otherwise. You all know your positions and duties. I expect flawless execution." His gaze swept over the assembled staff. Dismissed. As everyone dispersed to their stations, Elena found herself walking past the music room. The door was open and she couldn't resist stepping inside for just a moment. The grand piano stood in the center, its lid raised in preparation for the performance that would no longer happen. Almost without thinking, Elena moved toward it, drawn by an invisible force. It had been so long since she'd touched a piano, nearly a year since she'd had to sell her mother's upright to pay for medical bills. Her fingers hovered over the keys, not quite touching them. "What are you doing in here?" Elena jumped back, her heart racing. Richard stood in the doorway, his expression thunderous. "I'm sorry, sir. I was just what? This room isn't on your cleaning schedule for today." Elena flushed with embarrassment. "I was passing by and saw the door open. I wanted to make sure everything was ready for tonight, but then I heard about the pianist." Something shifted in Richard's expression as he looked from Elena to the piano and back again. He stepped further into the room, studying her with sudden intensity. "Do you play?" he asked abruptly. Elena hesitated, then nodded. "I used to, sir." "Used to?" He raised an eyebrow, moving closer. "One doesn't simply stop playing an instrument like this. Not if they had any true skill to begin with." The dismissive tone in his voice sparked something in Elena, a small flame of pride she thought had been extinguished months ago. "I studied piano for 15 years, she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I was accepted to the National Conservatory on scholarship before my mother got sick." Richard's eyes narrowed slightly, as if seeing her properly for the first time. He glanced at his watch, then back at the piano. "Play something," he commanded, "sir. You heard me. Play. Show me what this supposed scholarship was worth." Elena stared at him, uncertain if this was a test or a trap. "I haven't practiced in almost a year. I wouldn't want to disappoint." "That sounds like an excuse, Ms. Vasquez." His voice was cool. "And as you know, I don't tolerate excuses." Taking a deep breath, Elena moved to the bench and sat down. She placed her hands on the keys, feeling the cool ivory beneath her fingers. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the familiar sensation wash over her. Then she began to play, a simple Bach prelude, one of the first complex pieces she had mastered as a teenager. The notes came back to her slowly at first, then with increasing confidence as muscle memory took over. Richard stood silently by the piano, watching her with an unreadable expression. When she finished, he gave a small nod. Again. Something more challenging. Heart-pounding, Elena chose a Chopin nocturne, letting her fingers dance across the keys. The music filled the room, and for those few minutes she forgot where she was. Forgot about being a maid. Forgot about Richard Harrington and his intimidating presence. There was only the music. When the final notes faded, Richard remained silent for several long moments. Then he checked his watch again. "The first guests will arrive in 45 minutes, he said finally. "Can you prepare a 2-hour program of classical pieces suitable for a dinner party?" Elena blinked, not sure she understood. "Sir? I'm asking if you can play for my guest tonight, Ms. Vasquez. You have some skill, rough around the edges but serviceable for the purpose. You want me to be the pianist for your dinner party?" A cold smile touched his lips. "Unless you have other plans for the evening?" Elena recognized the trap immediately. This wasn't an opportunity. It was a test, perhaps even a form of punishment for being where she shouldn't have been. "What about my regular duties?" "Mrs. Hudson will reassign them." He straightened his cufflinks. "Well, what's your answer?" Elena knew she should feel insulted. He was clearly expecting her to fail, to embarrass herself in front of his wealthy, sophisticated guests. This wasn't about solving his pianist problem. It was about putting her in her place. Yet underneath the humiliation, there was a tiny spark of something else, a chance to play again, to feel the keys beneath her fingers on a piano finer than any she'd ever touched. "I'll need something to wear," she said finally. "I can't play in my uniform." Something like surprise flashed across Richard's face, quickly replaced by that same cold smile. "I'm sure we can find something suitable. I'll have Mrs. Hudson show you to the guest wardrobe." He turned to leave, then paused at the door. "Don't disappoint me, Ms. Vasquez. I'd hate to be looking for a new maid tomorrow." After he left, Elena sat frozen on the piano bench, her mind racing. What had she just agreed to? Playing for a room full of billionaires and power brokers, people who probably attended performances at Carnegie Hall and the Metropolitan Opera on a regular basis. Mrs. Hudson appeared a few minutes later, her expression a mixture of shock and concern. "Mr. Harrington tells me you're to play tonight," she said, studying Elena with new eyes. "I had no idea you were a pianist." "It never came up in the job interview," Elena replied with a nervous laugh. Mrs. Hudson didn't smile. "Come with me. We need to find you something appropriate to wear, and quickly." As they walked briskly toward the guest wing, she added in a lower voice, "Be careful, Elna. Mr. Harrington doesn't like surprises, and he doesn't like to be shown up in front of his guests." "I'm not trying to show him up," Elena protested. "He asked me to play." "Yes," Mrs. Hudson said with a knowing look, "and I suspect he has his reasons." In a spare bedroom, Mrs. Hudson unlocked a large closet filled with designer clothing. "Sometimes guests leave items behind, or Mr. Harrington keeps clothes on hand for emergencies," she explained, sorting through hanging dresses. "Here, this should fit you." She pulled out a simple black evening gown with modest lines. "Changed your life completely to care for your mother, didn't you?" she asked suddenly as Elena slipped behind a screen to change. "How did you know?" "The way you looked at that piano. Like seeing an old friend you thought was gone forever." Mrs. Hudson's voice softened slightly. "My sister was a dancer before her accident." I recognized that look. Elena emerged in the black dress, which fit surprisingly well. Mrs. Hudson nodded approvingly, then handed her a simple silver necklace and matching earrings. "These are costume pieces kept for guests who forget accessories," she said. "Now, about your hair." 30 minutes later, Elena barely recognized herself in the mirror. Her dark hair was swept up in a simple but elegant style. The black dress transformed her usual silhouette, and a touch of borrowed makeup highlighted her features. "Remember," Mrs. Hudson said as they walked back toward the music room, "no matter what happens tonight, you're still staff. Don't get confused about your place here." Elena nodded, but as she seated herself at the piano just minutes before the first guests were due to arrive, she couldn't help but wonder exactly what her place was anymore. Maid by day, pianist by night? A temporary entertainment for Richard Harrington's amusement? From her position at the piano, she could see the main entrance where Richard stood greeting his first guests, a silver-haired couple who arrived in a chauffeur-driven Bentley. He was all charm and warm smiles now, a completely different person from the cold, demanding man she knew. As more guests arrived and champagne began to flow, Elena started to play, keeping the music light and unobtrusive. Most guests barely glanced her way, assuming she was just another hired professional for the evening. Only Richard, standing across the room with a crystal tumbler in his hand, watched her with calculating eyes, waiting, Elena realized with a chill, for her to make a mistake. Dinner was announced promptly at 8. Elena continued to play soft background music as the guests moved from the grand foyer into the dining room, their polite laughter and conversation flowing around her like water. For the first hour, she might as well have been invisible, just another luxury in Richard Harrington's carefully curated world. Like the crystal chandeliers or the fresh-cut flowers, she had chosen pieces that wouldn't draw too much attention. Gentle Mozart, some Debussy, light Chopin, music that complemented conversation rather than demanding focus. From her position at the piano, she could see into the dining room where Richard sat at the head of a table glittering with silver and crystal, playing the perfect host. Occasionally, she caught him glancing her way, his expression unreadable. Was he waiting for her to fail? To hit a wrong note that would expose her as an imposter? A mere maid pretending to be something she wasn't? The thought made her fingers falter briefly, but she recovered quickly, determined not to give him the satisfaction. She may have been forced into this situation, but she would face it with dignity. As the main course was being served, Elena noticed a distinguished-looking woman with silver-streaked dark hair leaning toward Richard, asking him something. Richard's response made the woman turn to look directly at Elena with obvious interest. A few minutes later, as Elena began a Schubert impromptu, the silver-haired woman slipped away from the table and approached the piano. She stood quietly listening until Elena finished the piece. "You play beautifully," the woman said with a warm smile. Her accent was faintly European. Italian, perhaps. "I'm Isabella Montgomery." "And you are?" "Elena Vasquez," she replied, surprised by the friendly approach. "Thank you for the compliment. Richard tells me you're not the pianist he originally hired for tonight. How fortunate for all of us that the other couldn't make it." Isabella tilted her head slightly. "Where did you study?" Elena hesitated, unsure how to answer. From across the room, she could see Richard watching them, his conversation with the man beside him clearly secondary to whatever was happening at the piano. "I was briefly at the National Conservatory," Elena finally said, "but I had to leave before completing my studies." Isabella's eyebrows rose. The National Conservatory is quite selective. You must be very talented. She glanced back at Richard, then leaned closer to Elena. Richard didn't mention you were his regular pianist. How long have you been performing for his events? Before Elena could respond, Richard appeared beside them, a carefully crafted smile on his face. Ah, Isabella. I see you've met Elena. His voice was smooth as silk, but Elena detected an undercurrent of tension. She's been kind enough to step in this evening when our regular pianist fell ill. Isabella gave Richard a knowing look. She's extraordinarily gifted, Richard. Where have you been hiding her? Richard placed a hand lightly on Elena's shoulder, the first time he had ever touched her. His fingers were cool against her bare skin. Elena has many talents, he said cryptically. Perhaps after dinner we could persuade her to play something more substantial, something that would showcase her abilities properly. Elena looked up at him in surprise. This wasn't part of their arrangement. Isabella clapped her hands together. What a wonderful idea. The Meridian group loves a good performance. Philip was just saying how much he misses live music since moving from New York. Richard's smile didn't reach his eyes. Then it settled. Elena, why don't you prepare something special for after dinner? Your finest piece, perhaps. It wasn't a request. Despite the pleasant tone, Elena recognized a command when she heard one. He squeezed her shoulder once, then guided Isabella back toward the dining table. Alone again at the piano, Elena's mind raced. She had been playing simple pieces, well within her comfort zone after months without practice. But a showcase performance? In front of these people? She continued playing automatically, her fingers finding the keys while her thoughts churned. What was Richard planning? Was this just another way to humiliate her? To expose her limitations after a year away from serious study? Or worse, was he setting her up to fail in front of important business associates, creating a distraction or excuse if his business deals didn't go as planned? By the time dessert was being served, Elena had made her decision. If Richard wanted a performance, she would give him one. Not the safe, easy pieces she'd been playing all evening, but something that would show exactly who she was and what she could do, even rusty, even out of practice. As the guests finished their dessert and moved to the adjoining drawing room for coffee and drinks, Elena took a deep breath and rolled her shoulders to release the tension. From her music memory, she selected a piece she had been working on just before leaving the conservatory. Chopin's Ballad No. 1 in G minor. It was ambitious, perhaps too ambitious after so much time away from regular practice, but it was also a piece that had always spoken to her soul. Passionate, complex, moving from delicate vulnerability to thundering intensity. When the last guest had settled in the drawing room, Richard approached the piano once more. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice carrying effortlessly through the space. "While our original entertainment for the evening was unable to join us, we have been fortunate enough to discover an unexpected talent in our midst. Please enjoy the special performance by Elena Vasquez." He turned to Elena, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "Don't embarrass me." Their eyes locked for a moment, and Elena saw something in his gaze she couldn't quite interpret. Challenge, certainly, but also something else. Curiosity? Anticipation? As Richard stepped away, Elena closed her eyes briefly, centering herself. Then she began to play. The opening notes hung in the air like a question, tentative, searching. Conversations around the room gradually faded as heads turned toward the piano. Elena kept her focus on the music, letting her fingers find their way across the familiar landscape of the piece. The early passages were deceptively simple, lulling the listeners into a false sense of security before the complexity began to build. As Elena reached the first major transition, she felt the music taking over, her body remembering what her conscious mind had feared forgotten. Her hands flew across the keys, building intensity, then pulling back into moments of exquisite tenderness. She poured everything into the performance, her frustrations, her lost dreams, her determination, her hope. The technical challenges that had seemed so daunting minutes before now felt like old friends welcoming her back. The room had fallen completely silent except for the sound of the piano. Elena was dimly aware of the guests' rapt attention, but she didn't look up. She didn't need to see their faces to know she had captured them. As she approached the powerful coda, Elena finally allowed herself to glance up. The guests were watching her with expressions ranging from surprise to admiration. Isabella Montgomery was leaning forward in her seat, eyes shining. And Richard? Richard stood frozen by the fireplace, drink forgotten in his hand, his face a study in astonishment. The cool, calculating mask had slipped, revealing something raw and unguarded beneath. For that brief moment, he wasn't the intimidating millionaire or the demanding employer. He was simply a man moved by music. Elena's fingers thundered through the final passages, the emotional and technical demands of the piece pushing her to her limits. When she struck the final chords, the sound seemed to hang in the air for a long moment before fading away. Then came the silence, that precious second of stillness after a powerful performance. When no one dares to breathe, it was broken by Isabella, who rose to her feet applauding, followed quickly by the rest of the guests. The applause filled the room, accompanied by murmurs of appreciation and surprise. Elena remained seated at the piano, her heart pounding, her fingers trembling slightly from the exertion and emotion. She had done it, not perfectly perhaps, but with all the passion and skill she possessed. She finally allowed herself to look directly at Richard. He hadn't moved from his position by the fireplace, hadn't joined in the applause. His expression had shifted from shock to something more complex, a mixture of confusion, reassessment, and something that might almost have been respect. Their eyes met across the room, and for the first time since she had come to work for him, Elena felt a shift in the power dynamic between them. In that moment, she wasn't his maid. She was an artist who had just commanded the attention and admiration of some of the most powerful people in the country. The guests began to approach the piano, offering compliments and questions. An older gentleman in an expensive suit clasped her hand warmly. "Extraordinary, my dear. Simply extraordinary. I haven't heard the ballade played with such feeling since I was at the Philharmonic last season." "Where did you study?" another asked. "Do you perform regularly?" "Richard, you've been keeping this young woman a secret from us." Elena answered their questions politely but vaguely, unsure how much Richard wanted her to reveal about her actual position in the household. He remained in the background, watching the scene unfold with an unreadable expression. It was Isabella who finally broke through the circle of admirers, taking Elena's hand and pressing a small card into it. "We need to talk," she said quietly. "I'm the director of the Montgomery Music Foundation. Call me tomorrow." Before Elena could respond, Isabella turned to Richard with a knowing smile. "You've been holding out on us, Richard. All these dinner parties, and you never once mentioned your resident virtuoso." Richard's composure returned smoothly. "Elena's talents are a recent discovery." "Well, I'm glad we discovered her tonight," Isabella replied, giving Elena's hand a final squeeze before rejoining the other guests. As the evening wound down and guests began to depart, Elena remained at the piano, playing softer pieces once more. She felt strangely detached, as if watching herself from a distance. The events of the night seemed dreamlike. The borrowed dress, the unexpected performance, the card now tucked safely in her pocket. What would happen tomorrow? When the dream ended and she was back in her uniform, cleaning Richard's house, would anything be different? Or would he expect her to simply return to her duties as if nothing had happened? Elena glanced up to find Richard standing beside the piano once more, his expression inscrutable. "The last guests are leaving," he said quietly. "You may stop playing now." The morning after the dinner party, Elena woke before her alarm. For a few blissful moments, she lay in bed remembering the previous night. The feel of the piano keys beneath her fingers, the rapt attention of the guests, Isabella Montgomery's card tucked safely in her nightstand drawer. Then reality crashed back. Today was Sunday, her day off, but tomorrow she would be back in her uniform, scrubbing bathrooms and dusting shelves as if nothing had happened. She got up and dressed in her simple jeans and sweater, planning to visit her mother. As she passed through the kitchen to grab breakfast before leaving, Mrs. Hudson was already there sipping coffee. "Good morning," Mrs. Hudson said, studying Elena with curious eyes. "There's fresh coffee if you'd like some." "Thank you." Elena poured herself a cup, feeling the weight of Mrs. Hudson's gaze. "You caused quite a stir last night," the older woman finally said. "Thomas says Mr. Harrington signed the deal with Meridian. Apparently, the CEO was quite impressed with the cultural refinement of the evening." Elena smiled faintly. "I'm glad it worked out for him." Mrs. Hudson set down her cup. "You do understand what happened, don't you? Mr. Harrington meant to humiliate you. He expected you to fail." I know. Elena looked down at her coffee. And yet you didn't. Quite the opposite. Mrs. Hudson shook her head slowly. I've worked for Mr. Harrington for 7 years. I've never seen him look the way he did when you were playing. Like someone had pulled the rug out from under him. Elena wasn't sure how to respond to that. She'd caught glimpses of Richard's face during her performance, seen the shock there, but she had been too caught up in the music to fully process it. What will you do now? Mrs. Hudson asked. Do? I'll visit my mother today, and tomorrow I'll be back at work. Mrs. Hudson raised an eyebrow. And the card Isabella Montgomery gave you? I saw her press it into your hand. Elena hesitated. I don't know yet. She's the director of some music foundation. The Montgomery Music Foundation is one of the most prestigious arts organizations in the country, Mrs. Hudson said. They provide scholarships, fund concerts, sponsor musicians. She gave Elena a pointed look. You should call her. Before Elena could respond, they heard footsteps approaching. A moment later, Richard appeared in the kitchen doorway. He was dressed casually in dark jeans and a gray sweater, a sharp contrast to his usual suits or tuxedo from the night before. He looked surprised to see them both there. Good morning, he said, somewhat stiffly. Good morning, sir, Mrs. Hudson replied. I was just about to check on the cleanup from last night. Actually, Mrs. Hudson, could you give us a moment? Richard asked. Mrs. Hudson glanced between them, then nodded. Of course. She gave Elena a meaningful look before leaving the kitchen. Richard moved to the coffee pot, pouring himself a cup. The silence stretched uncomfortably between them. I'm sorry if I embarrassed you last night, Elena finally said. Richard turned to her, eyebrows raised. Embarrassed me? By giving a performance that had Isabella Montgomery practically begging to sponsor you? He shook his head. No, Ms. Vasquez, you didn't embarrass me. You surprised me. There's a difference. He took a sip of his coffee, studying her over the rim of the cup. You're not at all what I thought you were when I hired you. I'm exactly what I said I was, Elena replied. Someone who needed this job to help my mother. Everything else, she shrugged. It didn't seem relevant to cleaning floors and dusting shelves. Richard leaned against the counter. The Meridian deal went through last night. Their CEO specifically mentioned the cultural touches of the evening as a deciding factor. I'm glad I could help, Elena said carefully. Help? Richard's mouth curved into a faint smile. Ms. Vasquez, you were the difference between success and failure. Do you have any idea how much that deal is worth? Elena shook her head. $37 million, he said. And it happened because you played Chopin like you were born to it. Elena wasn't sure what to say. She certainly hadn't expected gratitude from Richard Harrington. Isabella Montgomery called me this morning. He continued. She's quite taken with you. Wants to offer you some sort of scholarship or sponsorship. Elena's heart skipped a beat. She called you? Why not me? Because she's smart enough to know you're not just some random pianist I found for the evening. Richard's gaze was penetrating. She figured out you work for me, though she's not sure in what capacity. She wanted to make sure she wasn't stepping on my toes by poaching you. And what did you tell her? Richard set his cup down carefully. I told her I would discuss it with you first. Elena stared at him, trying to understand this new version of Richard Harrington, the man who was treating her almost like an equal, talking about her future as if it mattered to him. Why? She asked finally. Why what? Why discuss it with me? Why not just tell her no? That you need your maid more than I need a scholarship. Richard's expression shifted, becoming more serious. Because I've been thinking about what you said when I hired you. About your mother being sick. About giving up your education to care for her. He paused. And I've been thinking about the way you looked when you were playing last night. Like you'd found something you thought was lost forever. He moved to the kitchen window, looking out at the gardens. My father wanted me to be a musician, he said unexpectedly. I studied piano for 12 years. I was good, technically proficient, but I never had what you have. Elena was startled by this personal revelation. What do I have? Richard turned back to her. Soul, passion, the ability to make people feel something when you play. He shook his head slightly. I gave up music to pursue business because I knew I would never be more than competent. My father never forgave me. Elena was silent, trying to process this glimpse into Richard's past. The piano in the music room was his, Richard continued. I keep it tuned, but I haven't played it in years. When I saw you looking at it that first day, I thought you were just curious about an expensive instrument. I never imagined. He trailed off, then seemed to collect himself. Anyway, Isabella wants to meet with you. If you're interested, I can arrange for you to have tomorrow off. What about my duties? Elena asked, still cautious. They'll be covered. Richard picked up his coffee again. Consider it a bonus for saving the Meridian deal. Elena nodded slowly, still not entirely trusting this new, almost approachable version of her employer. Thank you. I would like to meet with her. Good. I'll let her know. Richard seemed about to say something else, then changed his mind. Enjoy your day off, Miss Vasquez. He left the kitchen, leaving Elena to wonder what had just happened. An hour later, Elena sat beside her mother's bed in her aunt's small apartment, telling her about the previous night. Her mother, Rosa, was looking better than she had in weeks, a good sign that the new treatments were working. I wish I could have seen you play, Rosa said, squeezing Elena's hand. In a fancy dress at a Millionaire's party, like something from a movie. Elena laughed. It wasn't exactly how I imagined my first real performance would be. Tell me about this Isabella Montgomery. What did her card say? Elena took out the small ivory business card. Isabella Montgomery, director, Montgomery Music Foundation, and she read. And her phone number. And your boss is arranging for you to meet her tomorrow? The same boss you told me was cold and demanding and impossible to please. Elena nodded. I don't understand it either, Mom. He was so different this morning. Almost human. Rosa smiled knowingly. Music changes people, mi hija. It always has. When your father used to play his guitar and sing, even the most hardened heart would soften. This is different, Elena insisted. Mr. Harrington isn't suddenly going to become a kind, caring person just because I played Chopin. Perhaps not, Rosa conceded. But you showed him something about yourself last night. Something that made him see you differently, and maybe in the process you reminded him of something he had forgotten about himself. Elena considered this. He told me his father wanted him to be a musician. That he gave it up for business, Rosa nodded. Ah, so there is a story there. There always is. They talked for another hour, Elena filling her mother in on the details of the dinner party and the guests' reactions to her playing. It felt good to share this unexpected twist in her life with someone who had always believed in her talent. When it was time to leave, Rosa held her daughter's hand tightly. Promise me something, she said seriously. If this Isabella offers you a chance, a real chance to go back to your music, you'll take it. Don't use me as an excuse to say no. Mom, your treatments are working, Rosa finished firmly. And your aunt is here. And I am stronger than you think. Promise me, Elena. Elena hesitated, then nodded. I promise to consider whatever she offers. Good girl, Rosa kissed her cheek. Now go dream big dreams tonight. Tomorrow might change everything. Back at the Harrington estate that evening, Elena found herself drawn once more to the music room. The house was quiet. Richard was out at some function, and most of the staff had the evening off after the previous night's event. She sat at the piano, gently placing her fingers on the keys without pressing them. Now that she knew this had been Richard's father's piano, she saw it differently, not just as an expensive possession, but as a family legacy, a connection to the past. Impulsively, she began to play, not Chopin or Bach, but a simple melody her father had taught her when she was a child. A folk song from his homeland that always made her mother smile. She was so absorbed in the music that she didn't hear the footsteps in the hallway, didn't notice the figure standing in the doorway watching her, a complex mix of emotions playing across his face. Richard Harrington stood silently, listening to this simple, heartfelt melody that seemed so different from the technical brilliance she had displayed the night before. There was something in this music, something honest and unguarded, that touched a place inside him he'd thought long closed off. He remained there, unnoticed, until the final notes faded away. Then, without a word, he turned and walked away, his mind filled with memories. He'd spent years trying to forget and knew. Questions about the remarkable young woman who had, unexpectedly, turned his carefully ordered world upside down. The Montgomery Music Foundation occupied the top floor of a sleek downtown building. As Elena stepped out of the elevator the next morning, she felt painfully out of place in her simple blue dress. The nicest thing she owned, but nothing compared to the elegant surroundings. Ms. Vasquez? A young man with a friendly smile approached her. I'm Alex, Isabella's assistant. She's waiting for you in her office. Can I get you anything? Water, coffee? No, thank you, Elena replied, trying to hide her nervousness. Alex led her through an open workspace filled with people typing at computers or talking quietly on phones. The walls were adorned with framed concert posters and photographs of musicians performing in grand venues around the world. Isabella Montgomery rose from behind a large desk as they entered her office. Today she wore a stylish red dress that complemented her silver-streaked dark hair. Large windows behind her showcased a stunning view of the city. Elena, how wonderful to see you again, Isabella said warmly, gesturing toward a comfortable chair. Thank you for coming. After Alex left, closing the door behind him, Isabella sat across from Elena, her eyes alight with interest. I must say, you gave quite a performance the other night. Chopin isn't easy on the best of days, let alone after a long absence from practice. Elena smiled nervously. Thank you. I'm sure it wasn't perfect. Perfect is boring, Isabella interrupted with a wave of her hand. You played with heart, with feeling. That's what matters. She leaned forward slightly. Richard told me a little about your situation. That you were at the National Conservatory? For about 6 months, Elena confirmed. I had to leave when my mother became ill. Isabella nodded sympathetically. And now you work for Richard as his... There was a delicate pause. Elena realized Richard hadn't specified her exact role in his household. I'm his maid, Elena said simply, deciding honesty was best. I've been working there for 3 months. If Isabella was surprised, she hit it well. I see. And before that night, did Richard know about your musical background? No, it never came up in the job interview. Elena hesitated, then added, the pianist he hired canceled at the last minute. He heard me playing and decided I would fill in. Decided? Isabella raised an eyebrow. Or demanded. Elena smiled faintly. With Mr. Harrington, they're often the same thing. Isabella laughed. Yes, that sounds like Richard. She studied Elena for a moment. Tell me, Elena, what are your plans now? Do you intend to continue working as Richard's housekeeper? I need the job, Elena said simply. My mother's medical bills. Yes, of course. But is that what you want for your future? The question hung in the air. Elena thought about the conservatory, about the dreams she'd reluctantly set aside. I want to play, she admitted quietly. I've always wanted that. But sometimes life has other plans. Isabella nodded thoughtfully. Life often does. But occasionally, life also offers unexpected second chances. She reached for a folder on her desk. The Montgomery Foundation has a special program for exceptional talents who face financial barriers. We provide scholarships, living stipends, and performance opportunities. She slid the folder across to Elena. I'd like to offer you a place in that program. A chance to complete your education at the conservatory, with all expenses paid, plus a stipend that should cover your living costs and help with your mother's care. Elena stared at the folder, afraid to open it, afraid to hope. Why would you do this for me? You heard me play one piece. One piece was enough, Isabella said firmly. Besides, I trust my instincts. They've served me well over 30 years in this business. She smiled. Though I would like to hear you play again, properly this time. On a concert grand, not hiding in the corner at one of Richard's business parties. Elena finally opened the folder, scanning the papers inside. The scholarship offer was more generous than she could have imagined. There was even mention of a small apartment provided for scholarship recipients near the conservatory. I don't know what to say, she stammered. Say yes, Isabella replied simply. Say you'll at least try. The new term begins in January, which gives you time to make arrangements. She paused. Unless Richard refuses to let you go. It's not that, Elena said quickly. He actually arranged this meeting. He seems supportive. Isabella looked surprised. Did he? How interesting. She sat back in her chair. Richard Harrington isn't known for his generosity with staff. Quite the opposite, in fact. I know, Elena said with a small smile. Believe me, I know exactly what kind of employer he usually is. And yet here you are with his blessing. Isabella tapped her fingers thoughtfully on the desk. You must have made quite an impression. Before Elena could respond, Isabella's phone buzzed. She glanced at it. Speaking of Richard, he's downstairs. He said he'd pick you up after our meeting. Elena hadn't expected that. She'd planned to take the bus back to the estate. I should go, she said, gathering her purse. Thank you for this incredible opportunity. I'll need a little time to think about it to talk with my mother. Of course. Isabella stood and walked her to the door. You have my number. Call me when you've decided or if you have any questions. She squeezed Elena's hand warmly. And Elena? For what it's worth, I think you're exactly the kind of musician we need more of in this world. Downstairs, Richard was waiting in the lobby, checking emails on his phone. He looked up as Elena approached, quickly putting the phone away. How did it go? He asked. Good, Elena replied, still processing everything. She offered me a scholarship. Full tuition, plus living expenses. Richard nodded as if he'd expected nothing less. And will you take it? I need to think about it. Talk to my mother. Of course. He gestured toward the exit. My car's outside. I thought you might like a ride back. They walked in silence to where his sleek black car waited at the curb. As they drove through the city, Elena stared out the window, her mind swirling with possibilities she hadn't dared consider just days ago. Thank you, she said finally, for arranging the meeting, for everything. Richard kept his eyes on the road. I didn't do anything. Isabella would have found you eventually, with or without my help. Talent like yours doesn't stay hidden forever. Still, you didn't have to encourage it. He glanced at her briefly. No, I didn't. After a moment, he added, I called your mother's doctor this morning. Elena turned to him in surprise. You what? I wanted to understand her condition better, to see if there were treatment options you might not be aware of. He paused. I hope you don't mind. Doctor-patient confidentiality prevented him from sharing details, of course, but he did confirm that her prognosis is good with the current treatment plan. Elena didn't know what to say. This thoughtful gesture was so at odds with the cold, demanding employer she'd known for the past 3 months. Why are you doing this? She finally asked. Richard was quiet for so long that Elena thought he might not answer. Then softly he said, Because 30 years ago I made a choice. I chose what was practical over what I loved. I've been successful beyond most people's dreams, but... He trailed off, then started again. When I heard you play, really play, not the background music, but the Chopin, I recognized something. The thing I gave up. The thing I've been missing. He shook his head slightly. I don't want someone else to make the same mistake. Not when there's another option. They drove in silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. If I accept Isabella's offer, Elena said finally, I'll have to quit my job with you. Yes, you'll need to find a new maid. A faint smile touched his lips. I think I can manage that. 3 months later, on a crisp winter evening, Richard Harrington sat in the front row of the National Conservatory's recital hall. The space was much smaller than the concert halls where he usually attended performances, intimate enough to see the expressions on the performers' faces. The lights dimmed, and a hush fell over the audience as Elena walked onto the stage. She wore a simple but elegant black dress, her dark hair swept up elegantly. She looked nervous but determined as she took her seat at the grand piano. In the program notes, Richard read that this was a special recital for scholarship recipients. Elena was performing Rachmaninoff's Prelude in C-sharp minor, followed by a piece she had composed herself. As her fingers touched the keys, Richard watched the transformation he had first witnessed at his dinner party, the shy, cautious maid disappearing, replaced by a confident, passionate musician. The Rachmaninoff was powerful, dramatic, filling the small hall with thunderous chords and delicate passages that showcased her remarkable range. But it was the second piece, her own composition, that caught Richard completely off guard. The melody was hauntingly familiar. It took him a moment to place it, a more complex, developed version of the simple folk song he had overheard her playing that night in his music room. She had titled it Second Chances. As the final notes faded away, Richard found himself on his feet, applauding with an enthusiasm he rarely showed for anything. Around him, the audience followed suit, giving Elena a standing ovation. Afterward, at the small reception in the conservatory lobby, Richard watched as Elena was surrounded by well-wishers, fellow students, professors, Isabella Montgomery beaming proudly nearby. When she finally made her way to him, her eyes were bright with the lingering excitement of the performance. You came, she said, sounding genuinely surprised. I said I would. He handed her a small bouquet of white roses. You were extraordinary. Thank you. For the flowers and for coming and for... She gestured vaguely, encompassing everything that had happened since that fateful dinner party. "How is your mother?" he asked. "Much better. The doctors are very optimistic." Elena smiled. "She's sorry she couldn't be here tonight." "The treatment schedule, I understand. Perhaps the next recital?" "Yes, she's already talking about it. Actually, she asked me to thank you for the specialist referral. It's made a huge difference." Richard nodded, somewhat uncomfortable with gratitude for what had been to him a small gesture. Isabella approached them, champagne glasses in hand. "Richard Harrington at a student recital. Will wonders never cease?" He accepted a glass with a wry smile. "I'm full of surprises, Isabella." "Apparently so." She turned to Elena. "Professor Chen was very impressed. He mentioned the possibility of including you in the spring showcase." As they chatted, Richard observed the easy confidence in Elena now, so different from the guarded, anxious young woman who had first entered his home. Music had brought her back to life, just as her music had awakened something long dormant in him. Later, as he was preparing to leave, Elena walked him to his car. "I started playing again," he said unexpectedly. "My father's piano." Elena's eyes widened in surprise. "Really? That's wonderful." "I'm terrible," he admitted with a self-deprecating smile. "Years of neglect have taken their toll on what little talent I had, but—" He paused. "It feels good. Like reconnecting with a part of myself I'd forgotten." "Music never really leaves you," Elena said softly. "It just waits for you to find your way back." They stood in the cool night air. An unlikely friendship formed through an unexpected connection. "Will you come to dinner next Sunday?" Richard asked suddenly. "Your mother too, if she's feeling up to it." "Nothing formal, just—" He hesitated. "I have a new chef. She's quite good." Elena smiled, recognizing the invitation for what it was, not an employer's command. "But a friend's request, we'd like that," she said. As Richard drove away, he glanced in the rearview mirror at Elena standing under the lights of the conservatory. The young woman he'd once tried to humiliate had ended up changing his life far more than he had changed hers. Sometimes, he reflected, the most important lessons come from the most unexpected teachers. And sometimes what begins as cruelty can transform into compassion, if we're brave enough to let it.